Now that we've covered the basics of being able to open and close files in PHP, let's take a look at an example of how we can now actually write some data out to a PHP file. What I have here is I've created a simple little HTML form that allows the user to enter 4 different pieces of data describing a color. What the user can enter is the name of the color and a red, green, and blue value for that color. At the moment, to be honest, I haven't really considered whether that red, green, blue value will be in sort of a decimal-based number, a binary kind of number, or whether it will be hexadecimal. But for the moment, I don't suppose it really matters too terribly much. Right now, we can basically just consider this form our data collection mechanism that we'll then use to get the data that we want to write out to our file. Here's the actual code that I've put together for this form. Very simple, really not a whole lot to it. I have made the form self-submitting. This is a file called write_color.php, and the form submits to itself. So it will gather up those 4 different pieces of data, which have the names color name, red value, green value, and blue value, and will then submit them right back to this page again. To get started, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump up to the very top of my document, and I'm going to put in a set of PHP tags. In those PHP tags, my very first order of business is going to be to detect whether the data has been submitted or not. So I'm going to start off with a big if statement. Inside this big if statement, I'm going to use an isSet function. And what I want to do is basically figure out if the user has submitted the necessary data for us to then go through the process of writing it. So I'm going to say if isSet $_post for color name, $_post for red value, $_post for green value, and $_post for blue value. The idea being that if all 4 of those values have been submitted, then the form has obviously been submitted, and we can go on then and work on the process of actually writing to the file here inside the if statement. If any of those values haven't been submitted, then we essentially don't have the data necessary that we need to be able to write to the file, so the if statement won't be true and the page will behave just like it did before this PHP code was ever entered. Let's just see how things are working right now. I'm just going to put in an echo test inside that if statement. I'll jump back over to my browser and I'll hit refresh. Right now the word test doesn't seem to show up, but if I do submit the data, the word test does show up, so it looks like my if statement is being recognized correctly. I'll take that echo statement back out of there. Doesn't really belong. We know that my if statement seems to be working. There we go. And at that point I can actually start going through the process of writing to the file. Like we discussed previously, the first thing I might want to do is actually open my file. I think what I might do here though is I'm going to create a variable called file name, and that's where I'll actually store the name of the file that I want to open. I'm going to call the file maybe colors.txt. Seems like a decent file name for me. Then I'm going to put into a file variable the file handle that's returned when I run fopen. I'm going to open my file name, and I'm going to open it in append mode. The idea being that we might over time want to add more than one color to this file. I don't want to overwrite all previous colors every time, so the W mode would not be a good idea. But the A mode, the append mode, should let us keep adding new colors to this file every time we want to add a new one. Next, let me go on and check and make sure that the file actually opened. So if we actually have a file, that's where we'll actually want to go through and write it. This else statement is where we will end up if we are not able to open the file for some reason. Let me just put a comment in here for the moment. There we go. For when the file actually is open, the last thing I'm going to want to do is close the file again. So let me do an fclose for $file at the end, but before that, that's the point where we're ready to actually write out the data. There's really only one main function in PHP that tends to be used for writing data out to a file, and that's a function called fwrite. The fwrite function is very simple. All we need to do is we need to tell it what file it is that we want to write to, and then secondly, we give it a string. Whatever string we pass to it essentially will be written to the file, and that's about all there actually is to it. Special characters can be included in this string. I could do things like put in a \n for a new line, or a \t if I wanted to put in a tab. In our case, what I actually want to do is I want to put in the actual color values themselves. So I think what I might do here is I might create a variable called output, and into that output variable what I want to do is I want to drop in all of the values that were submitted from the form. Let me go ahead and copy and paste those. And then what I'll do is, instead of having them separated by commas like I needed them for the is set, I'm instead just going to append them together with a period. There. So those four colors all get appended together with a period, maybe just to help make it a little bit more readable. I'll put a new line at the end. That way every separate color that's submitted will end up on its own separate line. And then the output that I've put together, I will just put that in as the string that will be written out to the file. Shouldn't be too much to it. There's still some blank spots in this file, but we can come back and see about cleaning those up in a minute. Let's just see how our basic functionality works. Back over in the browser, if I go ahead and refresh my page, let's give it a first try. I'm going to say I want to create the color red. I think I'll do FF for the red value, 00 for green, 00 for blue. And now when I submit that, the form just blanks out. I don't see any errors. Let's take a look at the code and be sure. No errors seem to be appearing anywhere, so everything seems to have worked just fine. Let's go see if we actually created our file. Here's the folder where my script was running from. Here's a new file that wasn't there previously called colors.txt. If I take a look at that file, this is what it looks like right now. Looks like I have red FF0000 stored in it, so it looks like it worked just fine, fundamentally anyway. The main problem, I would say at this point, is that the data itself is all actually jammed together there in the file. That's not super pretty. Let me go ahead and get rid of that file, and let's try it again with a little modification. Back over in my editor, this time, instead of just sticking everything straight together with no separations between them, let me put a space between each separate value. There we go. With those spaces added, let's give the script another try and see how it works. I'm going to refresh my page, come down and try filling in red again. There we go. Submit. Nothing special shows up. Let's take a look at our data file. Here it is. And what do we have in it? There. Now we have all four pieces of information about our color actually separated with spaces. Is that sufficient the way that we have it now? Well, it potentially could be. Something we very, very much need to keep in mind is that if we're going to take and use PHP to write data out to a file, I would say that there's a much better than average chance that we may end up wanting to use PHP to read data back in from that file as well. So when we go to write our data out to the file like we're doing here, we need to stop and think, is this data going to again be readable? Now it's easy enough for you or I, human beings, to look at this file and pretty much be able to tell what that is, or at least anybody familiar with web design or web development would look at that and understand what it probably is. But could a program, could a PHP script be written to be able to read that data back in? Now of course we haven't looked at what's going to be necessary to be able to read data back in in a PHP script. But effectively, one thing we need to make sure that we have is some kind of good separator so that our PHP script will be able to separate one piece of data from another. So like here, I've used a space to separate the name of the color from each of the individual color values. That space could potentially be used as a separator in a script we write to be able to tell where one field of data ends and where the next field of data begins. The only problem that we might run into with a space is that what happens if somebody wants to put in a color name that has a space in it? Like this. Let's give this a try. If I come back over to the browser again, what I'm going to do is for my color name, I'm going to create a dark red. And for that color value, I'm going to do 990000. I submit that. It seemed to submit just fine. If we take a look at that, this is what it then actually looks like. Now here, there's not only spaces that are being used to separate one field from the next, but there's also a space in the name. So you could probably imagine that if a PHP script had been written to look at each one of the individual pieces of data separated by a space, it would get confused there by that second color. It would think that dark is the name of the color and that red, R-E-D, is the actual red value. You would think 99 is the green value, 0 is the blue value, and then there would be an extra piece of data hanging off the end of that line that our script most likely wouldn't know what to do with. So again, whenever we write data out to a file, we need to separate one field of data from the next, but we need to make sure that we do it in such a way that it's unambiguous, so that it's a piece of data that isn't used anywhere else. Let me show you how I might do that for this script. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of my data file. Since I'm about to change my format, it'll no longer be valid. Back over in my editor then, What I might do is, instead of putting spaces between each one of those names, what I might do instead is put in tabs. I can do that using a \T. The advantage of tabs is that they tend to be fairly difficult to type in a web browser. Most of the time when you're dealing with a web form, if you type a tab, what actually happens is you of course move on to the next field. So since they probably won't be included in any of the data in our file itself, right, we could use those as our separators to make sure that later when we try to write a script to read these pieces of color data back in, we'll be able to do it relatively safely. Let's give that another try in the browser. All right, let's try dark red again. Dark red, 990000, save. There we are. Let's try another one. Let's try blue. I'll just do 0000FF for that one. There we go. Let's go see what that looks like in our file. In the file itself, that's the way it actually appears. Depending on your editor and exactly how things are set up, those columns might line up a little bit better than they are here for me, but still, it's basically doing the job. I have tabs between each one of the separate different fields, so I should be able to, with relative ease, be able to at this point write a script that will be able to parse and read that data back in again. Alright, before we go ahead and move on from this example, we should probably go ahead and take care of a few of these other loose ends that are still lurking here in this file. One of those loose ends is, or I suppose maybe the primary loose end, is what do we do here if the file itself can't be opened? If for whatever reason we can't actually open the data, we should probably let the user know that this form is not going to be particularly useful right now. So redirecting them to another page would be another option, although we haven't done that yet. What I might do instead is I think I might jump up here to before the if statement, and I might create an array for myself. I'm going to call it errors. In that errors array, what I could then do is store any error messages that happen to occur. So maybe down here in the case where we're not able to open a file, I could do something like, say, array push to push a new message into that array. And I'll say into the errors array, push in the message, the data could not be stored right now. Please try again later. Isn't that nice? Down in the actual body of the page then, what I could potentially do is simply put in an if statement, where I check to see if there are any errors to display. So maybe something along the lines of saying, if the count of the errors array, if it's greater than 0, so if there are any errors. Then what I could do is go ahead and display whatever errors may exist. Maybe I'll put in an unordered list. I'll give it an ID of errors. And into that unordered list then I could go through and display any errors that actually exist. Let me do that this way. I'm going to put in a set of PHP tags, and I'm going to do a for each loop. I'm going to say for each of the errors, taking each one as message. Then for each one of those, I'll create a list item in the list that we're building. And then inside that list item, I will echo the message. And that should do the trick. That errors array then will give me a way of being able to show the user an error message in the case that we weren't able to open the data file. If we wanted to test that, probably the easiest thing to do would be to delete the file we already have, make the folder that file's in read-only so no new files can be created in it, and then try to run the script and make sure that our error comes up. That errors array is also then potentially something that I could use if I wanted to do form validation. If I wanted to decide on some rules for what makes an appropriate color name, what makes appropriate red, green, and blue values, I could incorporate some if statements up here at the top where before I actually do the processing to write my file. And if I find any actual errors for the file, I could go ahead and, or errors for the data that's been submitted, I could go ahead and put those into that errors array to be displayed to the user as well. And I could at that point essentially abort the storing of the data into the file itself if the data was seen as being invalid. But that is the basic idea. What it really all boils down to is that when we want to write data out to a file with PHP, we do so using an fwrite function call. And of course you need to be conscious of the format that you're writing the data out in so that it can potentially be read or used from PHP again in the future.